This is Lindsey Graham speaking to Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation.
A Republican colleague, Senator Tommy Tuberville, just this past week said on Steve Bannon's show that Volodymyr Zelensky is a dictator and unconstitutional. And he said this about Vladimir Putin.
He doesn't want Ukraine. He doesn't want Europe. Hell, he's got enough land of his own. He just wants to make sure that he does not have United States weapons in Ukraine pointing at Moscow.
Those echo some Russian talking points, Senator. I wonder if those remarks from your fellow senator represent the GOP.
No, it represents him and him alone. If you spend 15 minutes studying Putin and what he wants to recreate the Russian Empire. He's not going to stop in Ukraine. We celebrated the 80th anniversary of D-Day. It was a failure. It was the unnecessary war described by Winston Churchill. We had a dozen chances to stop Hitler. It's not about NATO, it's not about American weapons in Ukraine. It's about a megalomaniac wanting to create the Russian Empire by force of arms. If you don't stop him, there goes Taiwan. So we've been slow as hell of helping Ukraine.
So wanted to know your thoughts on Lindsey Graham's analysis of Putin.
The problem I face when dealing with Lindsey Graham is that he and I don't live on the same planet. I live on a planet where evidence and facts matter, and he doesn't. I would just say, where is the evidence that that Putin is the equivalent of Adolf Hitler? Anybody who knows anything about Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany really understands that Putin bears zero resemblance to Adolf Hitler, and Russia today bears zero resemblance to Nazi Germany. I mean, this analogy is just false. More importantly, where is the evidence that Putin is bent on conquering all of Ukraine, much less conquering other territory in Eastern Europe and recreating the Soviet Empire? There is no evidence to support that. He has never said that. He's never even alluded to that. And furthermore, if you look at the military capability he has, he does not have the military capability to conquer all of Ukraine, much less conquer other countries. If you look at what's been happening since the war started in February of 2022, the Russians have basically been bogged down in the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine. The idea that this is the second coming of the Wehrmacht, that Putin has this finely tuned military that he can overrun Europe with, it's not a serious argument. So there's just no evidence to support Lindsey Graham's argument. And Senator Tuberville is basically right. Putin has made it unequivocally clear since April 2014, when we said that Ukraine was going to become part of NATO, that this was an existential threat to Russia and that he was not going to let it happen. He has said this so many times, I couldn't count all the times that he said this, but we refused to believe it. And we therefore continued to push to bring Ukraine into NATO, which precipitated this war. But it was not a war that was started by a leader who is, in fact, the second coming of Adolf Hitler and wants to duplicate what Hitler did in World War II.
It's almost a form of Holocaust denial to make that comparison. What's also depressing is that there are a lot of people who aren't Lindsey Graham, who are just good kind of standard, old-fashioned, standard issue liberals who believe the same thing, if not about Hitler, which a lot of them do, but and about his imperialist ambitions.
You know, on this issue, I have argued since 2022 when the war started that there is no evidence, and sometimes I emphasize when I give talks, let me make it clear, zero evidence. I said there's no evidence. Let me make it clear there's zero evidence that Putin is bent on creating the Russian Empire, that he's bent on conquering all of Ukraine and then conquering more countries. There's just zero evidence to support this. And My friend Steve Walt always says to me, you shouldn't use such extreme language. You shouldn't say there's zero evidence. You should say there's little evidence, because you don't want to look like you're an extremist by saying there's no evidence or zero evidence. He says, John, say there's little evidence. My response to Steve is, I understand full well what you're saying. I understand when you're making a controversial argument like I am making, that you want to use softer language if you can. So I should use the word little instead of no or zero. But I said, Steve, I cannot use the word little because there is no evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody is able to point to any evidence. The one document that almost all of the believers in this fairy tale point to is an article that Putin wrote on July 12th, 2021. It's easily accessible on the internet. And this is supposed to provide evidence that he was bent on conquering all of Ukraine. If you read that document, it says exactly the opposite. It says exactly the opposite. There is zero evidence in that document that he's bent on conquering Ukraine. And again, he says the opposite. And I defy anybody to show me where he said before February 24th, 2022, that he was interested in conquering Ukraine and incorporating it into a greater Russia, and that this was the first step on the way to recreating the Russian Empire.
Right.
Just zero evidence.
He was saying these are the things that can be done so that this doesn't happen. If he were hell-bent on invading Ukraine, why would he have done that?
He went into Ukraine with, at the very most, 190,000 troops. At the very most. Most people think that's an unrealistic assessment, that he went in with fewer than 190. 190 is the highest number I can find. So I use 190. There is no way that he could have conquered all of Ukraine with 190,000 troops. People say he was interested in conquering Kyiv. Well, it would have taken probably about 1 million men to conquer Kyiv alone. This is a huge city. It has 3 million people. I saw a piece in the Wall Street Journal the other day talking about capturing the city of Kharkiv. And the article in the Wall Street Journal said that it would require 500,000 people to take Kharkiv, 500,000 Russians to conquer Kharkiv. Okay, well, Kharkiv is less than half the size of Kyiv. So that's 1 million people to take Kyiv. Let's assume that's wrong, and he only needed 500,000. Well, if he went into the country with 190,000 people, and he needed 500,000 people to conquer Kyiv, and he's supposed to be able to conquer the rest of the country, where are the troops going to come from? How is he going to do this? Does the Russian army look like the Wehrmacht to you? I don't think so. It's just not possible. Another piece of evidence to support this: the day after the Russians invade Ukraine, this is the day after they invade Ukraine, they send peace feelers out to Zelensky. They want to have negotiations. And as you well know, Katie, negotiations start on 2 tracks. One track is with Naftali Bennett, who is the Israeli prime minister at the time. And the other track is the Turkish track, which is the Istanbul track. And these are parallel tracks, and there's nothing happening in either track that contradicts what's happening in the other track. And the Russians and the Ukrainians are negotiating a settlement to the war. They don't reach an agreement, but by all accounts, they're making substantial progress in finding a solution to this war. This is immediately after it starts. Now I ask you, how can somebody who's bent on conquering all of Ukraine and then recreating the Russian Empire agree to negotiate, or actually, let me change that, initiate a set of negotiations? Again, the Russians initiated these negotiations that are designed to shut down the war almost immediately after it stops. And the answer is They weren't bent on conquering all of Ukraine. And in fact, if you go back and look at the negotiations, what was the centerpiece of the negotiations? It was a neutral Ukraine, a Ukraine that wasn't in NATO. This was the issue. As Senator Tuberville said, and I have said on countless occasions, and many others have said, only to be dismissed as Putin apologists. But the idea that this Russian army was bent on conquering all of Ukraine, or even much of Ukraine, is belied by the facts.
Because we were blessed with so much time with Professor Mearsheimer, some of this will be Patreon only. So to see the full stream with Professor Mearsheimer, please become Patreon supporters at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show, so you can hear his thoughts on Russia, Ukraine, and World War.